Hello there, my name is James Skerr, and I'm here to share some of my opinions about television and some rather controversial opinions I have about television. Maybe more specifically related to the BBC, but I am going to take a complete and utter balls to the wall approach about this. Now, the first thing I'm going to say is that by far the highlight of my television week, because I do spend a lot of my time watching television, but also talking about television, because I've had quite a lot of experience in writing for television, as well as quite a bit of knowledge about the mechanizations and how television is worked. Not just across things like the Beeb, but even across things overseas, like the Tiffany networks, even to networks that work overseas all the way in the Far East. There's a very specific structure, there's a very specific dynamic to how things are operated, how they work. But if we are going to be talking about the BBC, then first and foremost, my favourite programme, or programmes, and I'll explain why in a moment, is Mastermind, followed by Only Connect, followed by University Challenge. And if that sounds familiar, it is because it is BBC Two's famous quiz night lineup. From 7:30 till 9 o'clock at night, 3 quiz shows back to back to back, all ranging in differences in format, all ranging in differences in popularity, all ranging in differences of difficulty, but always ranging in terms of playability, as I call it, i.e. there's a very specific level of engagement between what is going on and what is happening to the people who are watching it. Now, the reason why this works is because it's something that people can be engaged with. It's something people can be involved with. If, for example, we didn't hear any of the questions that any of the hosts were asking the contestants, there would be no show whatsoever. Now, the problem I do have, and it involves quite a lot of game shows that the BBC is doing, game shows that the BBC has brought back, game shows that the BBC has tried to reinvent, and game shows that the BBC has tried as hard as they might to make work. And I've been round the block with so many of these, and even going as far back to when I was watching shows on CBBC when I was a kid, there were so many game shows that I watched, loved, and I even still talk about and still viciously go over in my head in terms of how these things work, why these things work, what was their influence, where did they get their ideas, and ultimately coming down to how, contestants were chosen. It's a very exciting, but it's a very, very bizarre kind of universe in which the selection committee, however it's done by the BBC, they must get around to doing there are some cases where the BBC will absolutely decide how they're going to select people to take part in the show. Other times, it is almost done manually. For example, when I applied for Richard Hammond's Blast Lab all the way back in 2009, with me and my 2 neighbours who would still live on the same street, surprisingly, I thought the process to apply and then even getting on the show, surprisingly, it was very straightforward, and the people from September Films that were talking to us over the phone, they were very, very open and actually very, very accepting. There was very few obstacles, and there was very few things that we had to be talked to about in excruciating detail, because again, we were like 11 years old at the time, and before you know it, in the middle or the back half of July, we were all down in London, and we won Series 4, Episode 3 of Richard Hammond's Blast Lab. Apparently, we won the most prizes out of anybody who's ever been on that show. And listen, Richard Hammond's Blast Lab is a great idea. I am very much on board with the idea of doing not only game shows in the format of Blast Lab that were also very interactive for both the people watching at home and the people taking part. But I also admired the fact that it had a science element to it. A lot of the questions, a lot of the scenarios, a lot of the experiments they did were very science-based. But it's a great way to engage in kids' imagination to how the world works, what can be done. It's a very, very good idea to engage with people's thoughts, minds, and if it was as easy as that to get on every single show ever made, bring it on if there was more ideas like that out there. But it's because of this analogy and this example is where I have to bring in my controversial opinions. Now listen, I've watched a bit of The Traitors. I've watched a bit of Squid Game. I've watched a bit of Destination X. And there is like various other game shows on the BBC I've watched. Even the rebooted Gladiators, I've watched at least the first full series of the show. But my problems with these, and problems with quite a lot of game shows the BBC has done in recent years, is surprisingly a bit of a bizarre one, and I'll try and keep it simple. They are good, but I don't think they're great. And I'll explain why. It's all the little things that they do differently. A lot of things that are kind of glaring in terms of why they did it. But there were also things that I have no idea why they would do it, because if it's failing to keep me around, if it's failing to keep me engaged, then I'm kind of a little bit hesitant as to what the point really is. For example, there is absolutely no reason whatsoever for Bradley and Barney Walsh to be presenting Gladiators. And the reason for that is this. I'm not against a father and son dynamic to be presenting a show. Honestly, no, I'm not. I think it's very unique, but I don't really watch a show like Gladiators for the hosts, if that makes sense. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the only connection that Bradley and Barney Walsh have towards the actual Gladiators IP is the fact that they've probably watched the show in different generations. I can imagine Bradley Walsh watching the original Gladiators, and I could also imagine Barney Walsh watching the Sky One reboot in the late noughties. The problem with this is that they're not sporting athletes. Well, okay, Barney might be. I don't really know if he is or not, but the point is that there's a little bit of a lack of connection, if you will, in terms of what these two know about sport or what they know about the Gladiators brand, because if we go all the way back to the early 90s where they had John Fashanu and Ulrika Johnson. Okay, Ulrika Johnson was actually quite a busy little TV personality, and well, it did get her a little bit closer to Hunter. Let's not beat around the bush around that. But John Fashanu at least could fall back on the fact that he was somebody who was involved in sports. So actually having him being involved, in fact, he was even a contestant during one of the Christmas specials back in the OG series. So it kind of made sense why, one, utilize him in some way, but also somebody who understood through things like injuries, through dynamics in play and stuff like that, when you were playing games like Powerball or The Wall, or even things like Suspension Bridge. There was certainly a level of thought as to why have somebody experienced and involved. That makes sense. There's no doubt about that. And even in the Sky One reboot, again, the late Caroline Flack may not be completely withstanding, but what is completely withstanding, however, is having Ian Wright as one of the presenters. Because as a legendary football player, Ian Wright has also been involved in a lot of programs involving sport, and he's actually really, really good to get along with. But just as from a presenting stand-up point of view, though I suppose having the sporting background is also the sort of thing he's most commonly recognized as. I don't get that dynamic or get the impression with Bradley and Barney Walsh. I just see that it's, well, the BBC thought, well, we could try this idea, and, well, we'll go with it, whether or not people think it's a good idea or whether it really makes sense or otherwise. And besides, aside from the chase, which seems to be put on every hour of every minute of every day, I think not seeing Bradley Walsh, at least for at least maybe 1 day or 2 days, it's not going to break the bank. It also puts a little bit of a strain on, other presenters who, or even people who've desperately wanted to get work in some way. And you see Bradley Walsh seems to be taking the spotlight in a lot of them. Now, I like Bradley Walsh, don't get me wrong, but it is a bit excessive, just from how I see it. But as far as the actual show goes for Gladiators, it feels smaller than the other two shows that came before it. It looks a bit like they tried to do some interesting ideas for the new games, but I don't think they're as engaging as they would like you to believe. And finally, I get the idea that they were trying to learn from the mistakes of the Sky One reboot, but I will also be fair to say that it kind of, by going all the way back to just trying to replicate the identity and the look and the razzle dazzle of the original series, it kind of makes the BBC version of Gladiators feel a little bit like it has a bit of an identity problem. Okay, so they brought Gladiators back, but it looks and feels like the show from the 90s. But except there is no wolf, there is no jet, there's no falcon, there's no warrior, there's no rhino, there's no shadow, there's no raider, there's no diesel, there's no cobra, there's no laser, there's no gold, there's no fox, there's no falcon, there's no phoenix, there's no hawk. I don't even think Atmospheres even gets a mention here away. So that's there definitely is a Nightshade around, and I will admit this is a little bit of a problem, because the dynamics and the personalities of things like Gladiators, because it had the satisfaction and the privilege of being the first of its kind on British television. Yeah, okay, fair enough. It gets a little bit of a free pass because that's just what we knew, what there was. And outside of many of the controversies, not only surrounding the production, but also surrounding a lot of the personal lives of those taking part. Oh, and Scorpio and Zodiac, let's not forget about them either. And the Sky One reboot also had issues in terms of like trying to engage in personality, because outside of Oblivion, Atlas, and Spartan, and possibly Enigma, quite a lot of the personalities for the Sky One reboot of Gladiators kind of fell by the wayside. Predator was just sort of there. Fire was just kind of there. Ice was just kind of there. Battle Axe, outside of having a really cool name, was also just kind of there. Doom was also just kind of there. Goliath, I think he probably had more success for the WWE after the show came to an end. And Tornado was like Oblivion, but he lacked the personality, the charm, and he kind of proved to be a bit of a thug in the end anyway. So it's disappointing, or even or at least Panther looked quite intimidating and quite distinct, but it just kind of it makes the show feel a bit like it takes itself too seriously. And it's a trend that also continues in just the fact that, well, like every other game show that's come about since the Sky One reboot of Gladiators, the background for every single show, 99% of the time, is just blue. And I don't know why, and I don't know what's so important or cost effective about the color blue, but it makes a lot of other programs very boring to look at. But that's my whole little spiel about Gladiators, is that there's, well, I suppose the only last thing I can say about Gladiators is that I feel they need to do slightly more, like more original things we genuinely have never seen before. And I'm not talking about going back all the way to the 1989 American Gladiators, because the rules and the choices they made for those sorts of programs were completely all over the place. Yeah, by the way, if you've never seen the original American Gladiators, you might want to take a look at it, because I'm not going to lie, it looks exactly like a glorified proof of concept, which brings us very neatly to both Traitors and Destination X. And I'm going to be talking about these two kind of together a bit specifically, because I feel like they're a little bit one and the same, unfortunately. And I mentioned proof of concept because when I watched Destination X for the very first time, like with a lot of game shows, the very first series are what I call a proof of concept. And the reason why is because producers of these sorts of shows, they may or may not be convinced about how this idea on paper is going to translate into good television, or even television that people will continuously want to watch, or the television that people will constantly want to be talking about and say, that was a really good show because it did this, that, and the other. Absolutely in no other way. There needs to be a really big talking point about things like that. And unfortunately, the Traitors kind of gets thrown into the same problem. And but the proof of concept is the one thing I feel like it hasn't gone away from my mind, but for one reason. I really don't like game shows that have those cutaways where you'll see a person sitting in a chair and then you see what their name is and then their age and then it says what they do for a living. Why, as a viewer, I need to be concerned about what people do for a living, or how old they are, or what part of the country they're from? Why I need to know that, I literally will never know. It's not that I don't see the intent, but if we're watching the show, surely we must be able to work out the difference at some point. We don't need to be showcased this every time they do one of those little cutaways. Mind you, when I say cutaways, the word Family Guy almost immediately comes to mind. And that's the thing honestly, that's my major criticism about things like The Traitors and Destination X. Here comes some sacrilege for you. And you ready for the most controversial opinion yet? They feel like American programs. And I mention American programs because I feel like they're trying to replicate the success and format and formulas of other American game shows, specifically on the Fox network, because I don't think, things like the Tiffany networks or anything like that would do the sort of things that they do. Because, listen, as somebody who's like an avid watcher of things like Hell's Kitchen and even American MasterChef, I know the tricks of that trade inside and out, and unfortunately it doesn't make the programs any more interesting, any more dynamic, any more unique than anything else that's just been done here in the UK, minus all of those exaggerated sound effects, the dramatic tones, the cutaways, the editing. If you want to know, by the way, what makes a narrative in a game show work, well, trust me, that's why they don't hire screenwriters. They hire editors. Editors are the real writers of game shows, especially ones that have a bit of a reality TV component to them, whether it's like Hell's Kitchen or Big Brother or Love Island. It's just how they do it. So, yeah, that's probably the most controversial opinion I have to hold about quite a lot of BBC-related game shows, is that they feel like they are following trends set by other people as opposed to setting the trends. And even when they try and stand out, I don't think they stand out enough. So my honest opinion is step away from what everybody else is doing. make it completely your own idea, make it something that absolutely would work because of the way it's been made, the way it's been done, the way it's lasted throughout the years, like Mastermind, like Only Connect, like University Challenge, and do away with things that nobody is going to buy, because even if you may not be as technically as, media savvy or, television savvy as, people like me or other people out there, I think even the average bloke on the street can sort of discern the difference. Whether this is a result of attitudes towards producers to viewers, or from commissioning editors to saying, well, it works and it makes money, but you run into the problem there immediately that you're making a program to make money before anything else. Because when you apply that attitude, it means that a very small number of people will be making money and everybody else will almost be out on their ears. And that's just my opinions about game shows. And I haven't even gone into the problems I have with soap operas or with comedy shows or dramas. But I think I'll try and save those for another day. If people want to know what my takes and opinions of them are, because honestly, I think quite a lot of them range, and even I will admit not to be an expert on stuff like that. I mean, I may as well start for what it's worth by saying that I think the whole 3 series of Happy Valley, I thought the entire show was okay. That should get the ball rolling, that shouldn't it? But until then, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see all of you guys again next time. Thank you.